That's when I understood that there's no way out.
I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Georgiy Gongadze is my name.
Ukrainian journalist Georgiy Gongadze disappeared on the evening of September 16, 2000. He was a renowned TV presenter and the founder of one of the first political internet resources, Ukrainska Pravda. In the 20 years since, the official investigation has established that the journalist was kidnapped, taken to the forest, and killed by Ukrainian police officers. Gongadze was kidnapped on the request of then-president of Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma. The president demanded that law enforcement intimidate journalists, activists, and politicians who were in opposition to him. But whether the president of Ukraine actually requested the death of Georgiy Gongadze is still an open question. Over these years, the investigators have not established the role of the head of state in the death of one of the country's most well-known journalists. The story of Georgiy Gongadze is key to understanding modern Ukraine. It explains why civil society still has very little trust in the government. During years of investigation, the politicians and law enforcement have discredited themselves. And that's why the story of Georgiy Gongadze, his disappearance and murder, is being told by the journalists, friends and colleagues of Gongadze, as well as his widow, Myroslava Gongadze.
I was surprised recently. One of my coworkers is getting married, and I was shocked to find out that he was born in 2000. And he doesn't remember this at all. For him, it's just history. I would have liked this young generation of journalists to remember what happened in their country in 2000. Because there's no full stop in this case yet. Because this crime subsequently, in a chain reaction, led to a lot of other crimes. Because this was about impunity. Journalists must remember about this and remind everyone else every year not to let it escape their attention. Because that's the only way we, as a country, can move forward somehow. This is a work of Picasso, which became a symbol for Ukrainska Pravda. When I asked Elena why Don Quixote, she told me that Georgiy referred to himself as Don Quixote, compared himself to Don Quixote, and liked this particular piece a lot. That's why when Ukrainska Pravda was being created, they decided to make this specific Don Quixote from Picasso's work into a logo.
Gia was like a local celebrity in Lviv because back then it was practically impossible to find Ukrainian-speaking people who don't come from Ukraine other than the diaspora. And then some dude from Georgia arrives, and not only does he speak Ukrainian, but he is also interesting. That is, he's well-educated, smart, handsome, knows a bunch of interesting stories, and went to war.
When Russia's aggression against Georgia started in 1992, he went there a couple of times. And at a certain time, his film, The Shadows of War, became a sensation of a kind. And part of this film was dedicated to the fact that Ukrainians helped Georgians defend themselves in the Caucasus. And that there would be the time when the Georgians will help Ukrainians. And just over 20 years later, that happened.
What I saw with my own eyes and what I took part in, the battle for Sukhumi over the last couple of weeks, is that there's a war with Russia. There's no doubt. And Russia can deny their role, that they have a role, and that they're helping as much as they want. But it's all a bluff.
He could make stuff up just like that. And what's interesting, it would all come true, however absurd it sounded at first. He was very, extremely strong-willed.
Georgiy Gongadze first gained recognition after his film about the war in Georgia and invited to the capital, Kyiv, to work at one of the first private TV channels, MMC Internews. Firstly, Gongadze was a TV presenter. Later, he became a reporter for the news service. And finally, he created and presented his own program, Vikna Plus.
Everybody knew him because he was a social person. He visited shows as a commentator, the most popular programs at the time, such as Пятый кут.
Where were our law enforcement bodies, ministers in particular, that you rewarded after? Do you not think that it's paradoxical that people failed at their jobs? Millions were transferred abroad. And yet you gave them awards.
Kuchma constantly tried to play the class card, throwing his weight around during that broadcast. And it feels to me that Gia, maybe he wasn't the only one, but he clearly demonstrated that the magic of Kuchma's power wasn't affecting him.
President Kuchma is living his illusions. This broadcast has proven this. He even admits himself that, after November 1st, we'll see a different President Kuchma. And this is a very symptomatic characteristic.
Firstly, dear, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Georgiy, firstly, this question...
Georgiy Gongadze is my name.
Georgiy, the question is for the security service, not for the Ministry of Internal Affairs.
I think that he probably got to know after this broadcast. To say that they crossed, he probably knew. Various monitorings were prepared for him. That is, there was no open anger or emotions in Kuchma when he spoke with me.
During the 1999 presidential elections, Leonid Kuchma was shooting for a second term. The government had increased its pressure on the media. He wrote for internet publications, collaborating with famous opposition politicians, the head of the People's Movement of Ukraine, Vyacheslav Chernovil, and the leader of the Socialist Party, Oleksandr Moroz. In April 2000, together with his colleague Olena Prytula, Georgiy started an online publication, Ukrainska Pravda.
He didn't feel comfortable on TV. He found it hard to negotiate with people, or it was hard for those people to negotiate with him. That's why he stopped doing that and moved on to the internet. He was only just starting.
Ukrainska Pravda, as far as I remember, was just a temporary project. That is, he was banned from working anywhere else in this area on TV because of this blacklist that he got on.
Gia tore a piece of paper out of a notebook and wrote the www address for me. He gave these pieces of paper to everyone so that they could visit.
Ukrainska Pravda was one of the pioneers amongst publications. I can't say that the internet had any special role at the time, at least not in political journalism. But he already started hatching, specifically with his texts on Ukrainska Pravda. But he was just a bud then. The government didn't really pay any attention to him. Gia had his own vision, a very clear vision of what Ukrainska Pravda is. I helped him. In reality, he was the driving force, the main person, the idealist. It was him who put meaning into this name.
One day he came and looked quite worried and anxious. He said that he was being followed the entire day. So as soon as he got into the taxi, or whatever that was, I can't remember now, that car would follow him. After he filed the report, the surveillance would stop.
There was a face-to-face meeting between Moroz and Gongadze in the corridors of the Verkhovna Rada. Moroz told him that very serious people were after him and advised him to contact the Prosecutor General's office.
In his letter to the Prosecutor General, Gongadze stated the license plate of the car that was following him and asked for protection from psychological terrorism. The Prosecutor General's office did not respond to the journalist's request.
The last evening when we walked home, he was slightly upset, slightly disappointed. He was asking, why am I always the revolutionary? I just want to live a calm life in a world that's good. This was worrying him.
That was one of the Saturdays when I had to work at 1+1. I think the shooting that I had was in Puszcza Ozerna, and Myroslava Gongadze was doing a workshop for someone that evening. Myroslava brought her kids, and I offered that when I went back we could all go together to Kyiv. I walked up to the door with them, and we realized that the door was shut and there was no one inside. Myroslava didn't have her keys. We stood outside the building for around 30 or 40 minutes.
Gia rang me to say that he's leaving so that she's not worried and he's going to be there soon. Then I brought the keys to Myroslava. Olena and I were on the phone almost the entire night.
In the morning, when we were on the phone again, I understood that Gia never made it home. That's when we understood that something happened.
I got a call from Olena. It was in the evening. She rang my landline. She said that Georgiy had disappeared. He left hers and never made it home. I told her, wait, how long has it been? A couple of hours, she said. He still wasn't there in the morning, so she rang again. I said, I got you, and went to the office. I didn't ring the president. I rang Litvin. told him, "This is the situation. We need to do something."
I looked at my phone in the morning and saw that I had 14 or 15 missed calls from Olena. I rang and asked her what happened, as this never happened before. She said that Gia disappeared.
We were bewildered at first, mainly because we didn't think that something this serious could happen to Gia.
2 days after Gongadze's disappearance, Ukrainska Pravda's editor-in-chief Olena Prytula appealed to President Leonid Kuchma, asking to find Georgiy.
He couldn't just leave the kids on the streets at night.
I sensed that something was up, and we already started filing reports. And everything that we had to do, we did. On Monday, I left and rang Sergei from Ukrainska Pravda and asked him to find a suitable photo, cut it out and write, "Find the journalist." I talked to all the fellow journalists working on TV. We all know each other.
On the morning of the second day, I, after consulting with Olena, posted a short note about Georgiy Gongadze's disappearance on the Ukrainska Pravda website.
On Monday evening, this became one of the main topics in the life of the country.
Only the lazy failed to write about journalist Georgiy Gongadze's mysterious disappearance last week.
His journalist friends carried out press conferences or speeches in the parliament nearly every day. The Interior Ministry is studying Gongadze's personal conflicts and professional activities. Almost a week after Gongadze's disappearance, Myroslava Gongadze was finally summoned for questioning.
I spent hours and hours non-stop at the prosecutor's office, at other bodies, the police, the SBU. I was trying to make them do something. It was a time of constant fear and stress.
The day after Georgiy Gongadze disappeared, he was seen in Kyiv.
At 10 o'clock, citizen Gongadze, who earlier disappeared, was seen and recognized.
Find journalist Gongadze. Find journalist Gongadze. On November 3rd, around 130 kilometers away from Kyiv, near the village of Tarasha, a decapitated body was found. The police did not confirm that the body belonged to Gongadze. However, Olena Prytula and Gongadze's friends decided to go to the village anyway and see the body for themselves.
Only later it turned out that they went to examine the body that was found in the Tarasha district. Of course, now when you say this, it sounds like a horror film. But in reality, back then, it was like a kaleidoscope for us. There was such an intense flow of everything that we didn't even have time to process what was happening. And now you think, no way, they actually went to see a beheaded body that was found.
Quite a few people told us about this, both those we know well and just the people who wanted to share information. Those were rumors, and I tried to verify each of these rumors. I would ring the police and ask if such and such body was really found, if that kind of jewelry was found. The police were quite evasive and answering something like, the body is 2 to 3 years old.
We got a call from Moroz and were told that a body was found that looked a lot like him. It was, to be honest, I hardly believed it, because prior to that we had many calls. But the pathologist described all the jewelry that he had in great detail. From first sight, I recognized him visually. Despite the body looking very frail, there were almost bones alone. But I remembered that he had his hands wounded, and during the X-ray, it was established that he had debris in his hand.
While we were trying to find transport to take his body, no one told us not to take it. And then this body disappears. This was such a strange story, to put it mildly.
The body was just stolen. It wasn't there.
And then the body ends up in a morgue. And his mother then didn't believe, and now she passed away, may she rest in peace. But she didn't believe that it was his body.
They should have summoned me first and foremost, no one else. I massaged him. I know every centimeter of him, every bone of his.
The probability that the fragmented remains belong to Oleksii Gongadze's son is no less than 99.6%.
We want to ensure the relatives of Gongadze are shown the personal belongings found in the place.
From the shape of the feet and the shape and the size of the toes, I can say that the probability that this is Georgiy is very high.
We only found out the fact that he was killed in one place and then taken to another from court materials. We did not know this for many years. To this day, we don't wholly understand what happened to the body and why it happened to the body.
This is the district where Moroz's constituency was. He came to play his own part in this story later.
On November 28, 2000, the leader of the Socialist Party, Oleksandr Moroz, accused President Leonid Kuchma of ordering the kidnapping of Georgiy Gongadze. Moroz named the Interior Minister, Yuri Kravchenko, as the person who immediately carried out the order. According to Moroz, the head of the administration of the president, Volodymyr Litvin, was an eyewitness and instigator. To support his accusations during a press conference, Moroz made public the tapes that, as he said, were recorded in the office of the president. The tapes were provided to Moroz by the president's bodyguard, Mykola Melnychenko.
There is an officer, and there are tapes. I will use everything I have.
In the tapes, you can hear President Kuchma swear and demand that Interior Minister Kravchenko deal with Gongadze.
Alexander Moroz made these tapes public. This was an important step. Why? You need to ask Alexander Moroz. Whether it's because the body was found in his constituency or he had his own political reasons to do it. But it was important that he made these tapes public.
Ukrainska Pravda has just lost its fucking mind. They're completely out of line. Look at that bastard, that fucking Georgian, that Georgian.
Who? Gongadze?
Gongadze. Someone must be sponsoring him.
Well, he actively works together with, with Moroz, with Grani.
Two explosive pieces of news came out of the situation. The first was, of course, the way in which the president of Ukraine spoke about a journalist with law enforcers, and which consequences this could lead to. The second was the mere fact of bugging the office of the president. That also came as a shock. People were just as shocked that that was possible.
He, needs to be deported to Georgia and thrown away. Take him away to Georgia and dump him there. We need the Chechens to kidnap him and demand ransom money.
I think I wasn't as surprised by the body being found as I was by the recording, because as I said, when the body was found, many things remained unclear. But when the recordings emerged, our rational assessment was already in action, and we could hear that it was Kuchma's voice.
Well, that came like thunder. Having listened to it again, it was shocking.
The name Melnychenko only appeared a week later. When the recordings had just emerged, it was an unnamed security officer that fled Ukraine. And then the name Melnychenko appeared.
A special committee for investigating the disappearance of Georgiy Gongadze was created in the Verkhovna Rada. Gongadze's colleagues demanded that it doesn't have any MPs who Gongadze criticized as its members.
Some folk craftsmen tried to recreate this experience from under the sofa. Well, they wouldn't do it with the president, but with themselves. I asked them how it went. They said, well, it's possible. So yes, from under the sofa, it kind of worked.
In general, there aren't any originals. At the time, a memory card cost around $100, so he was just recording. He had maybe 3, 4 cards, and he would reuse them one by one.
I heard part of them. What I could hear, what was made public, I heard all of that. I personally recognized the voices of these people. That President Kuchma said that something needed to be done with Georgiy Gongadze. That's for sure.
Gongadze's name was known to Kuchma from the beginning, but he did not single him out in May. The first thing Kuchma discussed were articles in Zerkalo Tyzhnia. So how did they get talking about Gongadze? The first mention is when Leonid Derkach talks with Kuchma about the provenance of a Russian newspaper article entitled Andrei Derkach is the Ukrainian Putin. Andrei Derkach is the son of Leonid Derkach, then head of Ukraine's security services. Derkach told him, Leonid Danilovich, it's all Gongadze. Gongadze is financed by Sorkis and Medvedchuk via Brodsky. So you should understand that Gongadze is not just against you, but against me. Here's some lines for you. Some filth that was. Derkach was the first one to discuss and highlight the fact that Gongadze was putting it all out on the internet.
So that I don't forget, there is this Gongadze.
This surname, I have.
Well, what a damn bastard he is, like you've never seen before.
His name was in something.
Search for it. Well, he writes all the time for this Ukrainska Pravda thing and posts it to the internet. Get it? But who's financing him?
Well, I have in.
But the main thing we need is for Volodya to say, for example, we must get the Chechens to kidnap him and take him to Chechnya, for fuck's sake, and ask for ransom money.
Kravchenko was the person who created the Interior Ministry in the form that it stayed in for a long time, probably until 2014. During his tenure, the Interior Ministry was a very significant body. The structure was branched, quite active, and well-built.
Derkach, the head of the SBU, had a serious conflict with Kravchenko. They both tried to get better access to Kuchma, both tried to become his favorite. And all of this coincided with Gongadze's murder. It's a very curious thing.
After the conversation with Kravchenko, the surveillance started.
Surveillance was carried out by special forces. They gathered information in a professional way, such as places where meetings were held, where they went, time, schedule, whatever task they were given by the operational services. They then create a report. Quickly, and in such a way that you would never notice them, they gather their information.
I remember when Georgiy filed a report with the prosecutor's office that he was being surveilled. Straight after this, there are recordings where Kravchenko reports to Kuchma that Georgiy filed the report with the prosecutor general's office. After this report, the surveillance stopped for a period of time, and then it started again at the end of August.
I did not hold such conversations with the president of the state. I did not receive any orders from the official, from the president of the state, and I did not give any orders to my subordinates.
The last of the recordings I had access to is dated September the 26th, 10 days after Gongadze disappeared. So the bugging continued at least until September the 26th. And the key date is Monday, September the 25th, the day when traditionally law enforcement officers would report to Kuchma.
And you hear the voice of the president of your country who discusses what to do with your husband, who's already been killed. And then you hear him discussing what to do with you. And he laughs, and he jokes, and he mocks me. That's when I understood that I have no protection. I don't have anyone to go to. I don't have a shelter anywhere. And that's when I made the decision to leave the country.
Kuchma out. Kuchma out. Kuchma out.
The president of the country was now associated with the person who ordered the murder of an opposition journalist. That quickly raised the degree of the protest mood. The first protest against the old government in the wider sense was the Forum of National Rescue, Ukraine Without Kuchma. So the processes which started after Georgiy Gongadze's death.
Kuchma out. Kuchma out. Kuchma out. We want the truth. We want the truth. On December 15th, 2000, Ukrainian civic activists started demonstrations. Their first demand was to carry out a transparent investigation into the murder of Georgiy Gongadze and hold President Leonid Kuchma accountable. A tent city was set up in the center of Kyiv. People took to the streets daily. That's how the Ukraine Without Kuchma movement started.
Back then, many people had hoped that they could achieve, if not his impeachment, few believed in that, at least make him resign under pressure from the protests. Besides, Kuchma felt lost. It wasn't for a long period, but he really was lost. You could feel it.
I'm a human being, and this will remain a scar on my heart, that's for sure. I have main tasks today, and for the law enforcement bodies too. These are: the first one is Gongadze. Do everything to understand where he is, if he's alive, or, God forbid.
At the end of February, if I'm not mistaken, the tent city was dispersed. There was meant to be a counterblow, a blow in response. And in a classic fashion, when would be the best time to make this blow? On March 9th, Taras Shevchenko's birthday.
What happened then had weakened Kuchma's authority. Kuchma never managed to change the constitution, something he really wanted to do. Ukraine stepped away from this trajectory of dictatorship on which it had gotten in 2000.
These were the things that made the Maidan inevitable in the way in which it came about at the end of 2004.
Leonid Kuchma's second term ended in 2004. By that time, the murder of Georgiy Gongadze still had not been investigated. The demand to hold those involved in the murder of the journalist responsible was one of the goals of the Orange Revolution, which started in November 2004 as a protest against falsified presidential elections. Leonid Kuchma did not run. The government-endorsed candidate was Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych. After mass protests, the government agreed to rerun a second round of elections between the candidates. As a result, opposition candidate Viktor Yushchenko became president. He promised under his tenure the murderers of Gongadze would be punished. 2 months after the new president's inauguration, in March 2005, investigators from the prosecutor's office arrested the police officers who kidnapped Gongadze. They testified against their supervisor, Police General Oleksii Pukach. He was hiding from the investigators.
The investigation prior to 2005 seemed rather arbitrary to me, and only after Yushchenko called it a priority did things start to move forward. The operative's picture looked something like this. A couple of police groups surveilled Gongadze.
One of these groups witnessed Gongadze being shoved into a car that had Pukach, Protasov, Kostinka and Popovich inside. When Yushchenko came to power, and under the safety of protection, the 2 key eyewitnesses eventually testified. And thanks to these people, Protasov, Kostenka and Popovich were arrested and would reveal exactly what went on.
The head of the surveilling unit, Pukach, gave a command to his subordinates, his crew team. Gongadze was put into a car, taken to the Tarashcha forest, and on the way they stopped by, I think it was kind of unprofessional or just spontaneous, because they stopped to get a spade.
And these 3 people pulled the tied journalist out of the car, drag him to the forest at midnight. He is resisting. Pukach tightens the belt around his neck. And is that okay? Is that normal? And that is what, pardon me, law enforcement officers did. And these people were already supposed to have finished their sentences. Well, Protasov had died. The working version, both in the media and in the investigation, went something like this. Kuchma summons Kravchenko, starts ranting about Gongadze's writings, and allegedly gives instructions to deal with this Georgian. After that, Kravchenko summons General Ferre, who later fell into a coma for 6 years and was disconnected from life support. Ferre, in his turn, either one-on-one or in front of Kravchenko, tasks Pukach. Pukach forms the group. The group executes the crime. Gongadze dies.
We had a series of detentions then. Pukach's accomplices were being detained, and it somehow happened that Piskun announced that Kravchenko would be questioned. At that moment, he was no longer in power. He just kind of lived his private life. He was the minister who allegedly gave these orders to Pukach, as the court process had revealed. Kravchenko's case is closed on non-rehabilitating grounds due to his death. So he is considered not the organizer, but his name is featured. But at the same time, to end his life in a suicide only because of a public summons for interrogation was also very weird.
Ex-Interior Minister Yuri Kravchenko was summoned for questioning on March 4, 2005. Prosecutor General Sviatoslav Piskun did it publicly during a press conference. According to recordings of conversations inside the president's office at the time, the Interior Minister was the connecting link between Leonid Kuchma and the direct executor of the murder, Oleksii Pukach. Kravchenko did not attend the questioning at the prosecutor's office. He was found dead inside his own house the same day. According to the investigation, the former Interior Minister committed suicide. He was shot in his own head with a handgun twice. Another potential witness of the organization of the kidnapping, Yuri Dagayev, had also died at the time. He was formerly Kravchenko's subordinate. Kravchenko's other subordinate, Edward Ferre, who at the time of the murder was the Interior Minister's chief of staff, fell into a coma where he spent 6 years until his death in 2009.
I do believe that he committed suicide. I do not think it was a murder, to be honest with you. It was 2004, and when the new government arrived, it seemed that all the schemes that were in place prior and that way of life had collapsed. To say that it was legal, they feared that because everything had collapsed, or it felt like everything had collapsed. Somebody would come after them. Only later it became apparent that it was all in vain, that nobody was going to come.
Kravchenko was that connecting link who could really explain what happened between Kuchma and Gongadze, and the Interior Ministry's role in the operation, and why it agreed to play that role. After Kravchenko's death, the chances of a resolution became close to zero. All the documents were destroyed by Pukach himself. Where did the task forces go? What did they do? Who was part of them? All these documents disappeared.
The Kyiv Court of Appeals has declared 3 former employees of the Ukrainian Interior Ministry's Foreign Surveillance Department and Criminal Intelligence Unit guilty of murdering Georgiy Gongadze. They are Valery Kostenko, Mykola Protasov, and Alexander Popovich. They were sentenced to 12 to 13 years imprisonment each. This footage shows law enforcement officers' arrest of Oleksii Pukach, who was accused of organizing the murder of journalist Georgiy Gongadze. Former Police General Oleksii Pukach, who led the group that kidnapped and killed Gongadze, was found and arrested on July 21, 2009, in a village in the Zhytomyr region, 230 kilometers away from Kyiv.
He lived with a partner and her child in a village in the Zhytomyr region. They had a couple of cows.
During the interrogation, Oleksii Pukach admitted to killing Georgiy Gongadze. He said that a month after the murder, he reburied the body at the request of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. He decapitated him and buried the head separately. Law enforcement found a skull in the place where Pukach directed them. An examination established that it belonged to Gongadze.
The discovery of Pukach in 2009 was not just surprising, it was a sensation. How had someone managed to live in hiding for almost 8 years while being one of the most wanted people for all law enforcement bodies? How would he manage to stay free all this time? He had been arrested before. He should have been well known to the police.
On January 29, 2013, Oleksii Pukach was found guilty of murdering Gongadze. He was given a life sentence, life imprisonment with confiscation of property and the right to retain the title.
What he says that he didn't want to kill, it was accidental, I would never believe that. For me, Pukach's team was from the very beginning set on the murder and the death of the journalist.
I don't have any doubts about this version of events. Pukach was exactly that person who executed the murder. The main question for us now is who ordered it. But it's not a question I need to ask. However, the law enforcement agencies can't put a full stop in answering this question.
Ask Litvin and Kuchma about the motives and intentions.
What we have at the end is Pukach, who is in prison and asking for an appeal. Protasov, who was sentenced to 13 years and died a couple of months prior to release. 2 executors, a dead Kravchenko, a dead Fere. And that is it. I think this whole case can get a revival only when the suspects or the accused want to speak about it.
I didn't receive any orders from the official, from the presidents of the state.
Pukach Oleksii.
Life imprisonment with property confiscation.
"20 years later, there are no fewer questions about the recordings of conversations held in the office of Leonid Kuchma, which were made public by the head of the Socialist Party, Alexander Moroz. The president's bodyguard has failed to provide original recordings. In 2000, just before the recordings were made public, Melnychenko fled Ukraine and went first to the Czech Republic, then Germany, before receiving political asylum in the United States. Melnychenko did return to Ukraine after the Orange Revolution and even became an MP in the Socialist Party. However, he refused for a long time to testify in the case of the murder of Georgiy Gongadze. The journalist had established that Melnychenko, prior to the recordings being made public, shared the information about having them not only with Alexander Moroz, but also with other politicians. One of them was Yevgen Marchuk, the secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, journalists had also determined that Melnychenko sold recordings to the Russians between 2002 and 2004, including to oligarch Boris Berezovsky and employees of the Federal Security Service.
It quickly became clear that the case was too complicated and had too many players. It became clear pretty much when Melnychenko's tapes emerged. We had too many questions that didn't have answers. Who is Melnychenko? Why now? What role did other Ukrainian politicians have? Why Moroz? Is there any connection with other players?
Georgiy Gongadze's death was our generation's burden. It's our pain. We've remembered about him for a long time. We did not manage to end this case. I think merely because we bumped into a wall made of adhesions between law enforcers and special forces in Ukraine, Russia, and where the denominator was, the SBU, the FSB, the Interior Ministry, the bandits. The common denominator was the Soviet KGB.
When was the Moroz tape edited? The process began on September the 18th, or roughly speaking, a day later. We know this from the metadata on an original audio file called Gong01, which was on CDs passed on to Vienna for analysis. In other words, Mykola provided it. When I accessed this file's metadata, I saw the editing began on the 18th. It's a serious argument.
Well, first of all, the tapes were migrating. Moroz wasn't the first one to be shown them. Melnychenko came to Simonenko, Timoshenko, let alone Marchuk, who knew from the very first day that the office was bugged.
Yevgen Marchuk became the secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine during the height of the election campaign.
Imagine a person who's in a very high-up position responsible for the security of a country. As we understand now, he knew in advance that the president's office was bugged, and he pretends he tells us now that in no way was he interested in the tapes. Well, I don't believe him.
The story with the Melnychenko tapes is a manipulation of society. That is, we did not receive all the information. We did not get the raw recordings of what was used in these tapes. We did not wholly understand back then how Melnychenko got them.
When the tapes first emerged, when they became public, Melnychenko looked like a person who overstepped suppositive restrictions while carrying out his civic duty of informing society about the events in the president's office. But then, when it became clear that he tried to sell these tapes before, we got the urge to put gloves on.
There was a time when I really did speak with Mykola. I had a feeling that he spoke the truth. He always maintained that he did the recordings individually. I lost a certain level of respect for him when he refused to testify in court regarding the recordings. Without his testimony, the recordings cannot be used as evidence. Mykola Melnychenko, as far as I know, did not agree to cooperate with the investigation and was not ready to testify in court about the origins of these tapes. That's why these recordings were not ordered to the court materials in the case. However, I believe that the investigators could have used these recordings in order to study this case deeper.
Ukraine experienced another change of government in 2010. Viktor Yanukovych became president. He started rebuilding the rigid power vertical destroyed under his predecessor, Yushchenko. The president's circle, as well as the circle of his party of regions, headed the law enforcement agencies. In 2011, the Prosecutor General's office officially accused Leonid Kuchma of murdering Georgiy Gongadze. However, the case was not heard in court. The Constitutional Court of Ukraine has stated that the evidence of guilt, the recordings of the president that were obtained illegally, cannot be used as evidence during court processes. Therefore, the prosecutors could not use against Kuchma the only evidence in the form of the tape with recordings made in his office.
Leonid Kuchma is suspected of an abuse of power, of giving illegal orders to officials in the Ministry of Internal Affairs, leading to the murder of a journalist.
The prosecutors state that there is more than enough evidence of Leonid Kuchma's involvement in the murder of journalist Georgiy Gongadze. That's why the institution says the investigation will be completed in the nearest future.
At the time, the deputy chief prosecutor and the head of the main investigation department at the Prosecutor General's office, Rinat Kuzmin, was the instigator of bringing Kuchma into the case as the person who potentially ordered the murder of Gongadze. It was necessary to put an end to the case of accusing Kuchma, and put an end in a predictable way, to remove Kuchma from the list of people who potentially ordered the murder of Gongadze. An opportunity arises to end this situation. In my opinion, Kuzmin, when he instigated the criminal case against Kuchma as the person who ordered the murder, knew how it would end. That it won't be proven that Kuchma ordered the murder of Gongadze. And Leonid Kuchma is now fully rehabilitated, at least in a legal sense.
I came across him and talked to him a couple of times during and after questioning and court hearings. He argued that if something was found during those years, it would have been passed to him.
I can swear by the Constitution and the Bible that I never gave such a criminal decree and essentially could not give such a decree. I could not.
I do not rule out that Mr. Kuchma could be an eyewitness in the case if he repents and gives sincere confessions about who encouraged him.
I am lacking information from the investigators. I don't know what the investigators established specifically about the recordings. The investigation regarding the method of killing is complete. Pukach was sentenced as well as his accomplices and so on. Exactly where they kidnapped him, where they took him, how he was choked, reburied, we know all this. But the political side of it, there is no information from the investigators. I don't know what information is out there regarding this, whether the recordings were really made in this way or in a different way.
I still do not believe in this version of events where Kuchma ordered the killing. Partially, it's a concatenation of circumstances. Partially the executors, partially the execution of a command he never gave. Who gave it is another question. That's why I didn't believe in it back then, and I don't believe it now.
Does it really matter if this person gave the order? Does it really matter who left when and where and who was on watch? Does it matter what type of rope was tied around his neck, where they cut and so on? This is not what will go down in history books. What history will say is there was a government, there was an interior minister, there was a president. There was a system in a country that allowed not just anyone, but government officials with all the powers given to them by the nation, to kill a man.
I also think that Kuchma is guilty, but I don't know now. I am lost because there is so much information, whether Kuchma, roughly speaking, gave the order or created a situation where Kravchenko obeyed his intentional or unintentional, misinterpreted order. Or maybe it was a story about who managed to win the favor of Kuchma, and some were prepared to do things that would put them well ahead of the other candidates in taking Kuchma's place in the future.
What did this lead to? In my opinion, this definitely led to Ukraine's journey towards the West critically slowing down, meaning this progress had stopped. That's it. The murder of a journalist whose extremely suspicious conversations in his office that were enough for the West to hide its helping hand behind its back led to Kuchma's cutoff from the West. And of course, this came in very handy for Russia.
Of course, it was Russia who did it. And then we see Ukraine, again, turning to the embrace of the Russian Empire. The target was 100% achieved.
I think there was a personal motive, his personal dislike of Gongadze, who was just loud and asked many questions, and the first stone in the rockfall just started to roll. Kuchma is definitely responsible for the system that he built. Most likely there were a couple of layers simultaneously. That is, we had the murder of Georgiy Gongadze and the tasks this murder was supposed to solve. Secondly, it was the aftermath of the murder. The resonance that the murder had in society became the basis for the interdepartmental struggle of the security forces inside Ukraine. Then there are Ukrainian and foreign political or special services who begin to pursue personal interests. Melnychenko and Kulchuga's tapes meant bringing it to the international level.
Different forces could use the Gongadze course in different directions. This case was used by everyone. Political forces in Ukraine, Russia could use it, but Kuchma's losing respect was his own doing, thanks to his creation of an oligarch system in Ukraine.
Whether he actually wanted Georgiy Gongadze's death or not, I'm afraid only he knows himself. However, everything he said led to his death. Unfortunately, there is a political consensus not to mess with Kuchma, to let him live the rest of his life. To be honest, I don't know how good his sleep is. I really hope I get to talk to Kuchma, to have a conversation with him before he dies. I cannot do this while I'm a journalist. For me, this conversation would have been quite unprofessional. I cannot afford that. The emotions would have prevailed, the prejudice and despair. We have come across each other in public places, in everyone's view. I didn't have the opportunity in such conditions to ask him the only question that interests me. How did it actually happen? Kuchma at least knows something, and he possibly won't tell anyone but me.
The only time I could look into Kuchma's eyes since Georgiy's murder was when I saw him at the funeral for Alexander Yemets. When Kuchma came, he greeted the family, and then he saw me. He looked, he raised his head, and then he quickly looked down and rushed out of the room. That's why, for me, Kuchma is to blame for the fact that Georgiy is not with us today, for Georgiy's death. And the rest is for the investigators to decide.
Georgiy Gongadze was only buried in 2016. The journalist's body was in a morgue for 16 years. Georgiy's mother did not recognize that it was her son's body. 4 months after the funeral ceremony for Georgiy Gongadze, another Ukrainska Pravda journalist was killed in the center of Kyiv. On July 20th, unidentified suspects blew up the car with journalist Pavel Sheremet inside it. This crime has not been solved.
What we're trying to do in this country is build a democratic society where such situations won't be repeated. It's hard to say this here, near the monument for Pavel Sheremet, to be honest with you. Right now, we're at the intersection of Ivana Franka Street, 50 meters away from the place where Pavel Sheremet was blown up. 20 years later, the situation had repeated itself under different, awful circumstances, some of which are very similar. Another important and awful thing is repeated too, the crime staying unpunished. What has happened to Sheremet now and what is happening to many of our other colleagues becomes possible also because of the Gongadze's case not being resolved. So this is such a significant case that continues to be a pivot for Ukrainian government all of these past 20 years. Had Ukraine found the strength to hold a state leader accountable for the death of a journalist back then, it would have been a completely different country today. We understand that. How to live knowing that somewhere near you lives a person who commanded to kill Georgiy? Unfortunately, you get used to it. That is, you don't accept it. That's a different thing. But you get used to it, unfortunately. And not just you. Society gets used to it too.